Welcome back to the Reimaginers, a series where we turn to the past to explore how education has previously been reimagined, by whom and for what purposes. Today we look at educational change in Boston during the 1970s. In our collective memory, this period in Boston is defined by white resistance to court-ordered desegregation, a resistance which regularly took violent forms. For many, Boston's desegregation story is a testament to the fact that racism is not a regional malady, but a national cancer. However, the emphasis on white resistance to desegregation and the anti-Black policies and practices of the Boston public school system has overlooked Latinx struggles for educational justice during this period. Indeed, the demographic shifts in Boston and the demands of its Latinx community during this period provide an important history for us to consider the potential inclusivity and exclusivity of education policies and practices. Today, to help explore this history, I'm joined by my co-host, Amber Joseph. Amber, can you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Hi, I'm Amber Joseph. I'm a public school educator in New York City. I teach history and civics. I'm also the product of New York City public schools. And just personally and professionally, I take an interest in racial histories of the United States, particularly in how that shapes politics and national identity. So I'm very happy to be here today.
And for that reason, I'm so glad to be doing this interview alongside you. We're also incredibly excited to be joined today by Dr. Tatiana Cruz.
Hi.
Dr. Cruz is an assistant professor of American history at Lesley University. She earned her PhD from the University of Michigan and has held fellowships at Harvard Kennedy School's Ash Center for Democratic Governance and Innovation, as well as Boston College's African and African Diaspora Studies program. Dr. Cruz studies race and gender in modern U.S. culture, and she specializes in African American history, Latinx history, and 20th century social movements. She is currently working on a manuscript that examines African Americans and Latinx racial formation, community development, and grassroots mobilizations for racial justice in Boston during the 1960s and 1970s. We're so excited to have you with us today and are thrilled for this opportunity to learn from you.
Thank you for inviting me.
So I guess I'll start with our first question. So in your work, you highlight the ways that Boston school administrators racially classify Latinx students for school assignments based on the 1974 court order for desegregation. And you actually describe these classifications as having, and I quote, an arbitrary basis of the student's perceived skin color. Can you talk more about what this process of racial classification looked like and its impact on families and students?
Yeah, sure. So first, it's funny now talking about everything using Latinx because I use it in my work, but certainly was not a term that we used in the past. So there was not even, Latino wasn't even being used. So 1970, they rolled with Hispanic on the census. So in the 1960s and 1970s, as the Latinx community is growing in Boston, it's clear that the kind of white power structures didn't really know where to classify Latino people. Now people are starting to understand that Latinx people can be of any race and mixed race. Many of us are mixed race, and I was actually interviewed by a census guy the other day, so I can talk about that at some point. But it's very interesting to think of how far we've come or how little we've come in terms of understanding Latinidad. But in this time period, there was no clear sense of race in terms of that. It was mostly about language. So they would call them the Spanish-speaking community, and occasionally they call it Hispanic community. So when the Morgan case was resolved in 1974 and desegregation happened in Boston, there was really no mention of what would happen to Latinx people and students in particular. So they started to try and work through this in the Boston schools by identifying them as Hispanic white or Hispanic Black. So in the archival records, that's what I saw, a lot of lists of Hispanic white and Hispanic Black in particular schools. And this was interesting because I started to kind of explore, how did we get this list? Who made this list? And what I found was, especially through the oral histories I conducted, that it was a lot of teachers were just designating, were just going around the classroom because it was time to figure out who fell under what category for desegregation purposes. So they would go around and say, okay, phenotypically you look Black, phenotypically you look white. Occasionally they would call in a parent, where would you classify your own child, right? Which is really confusing, particularly to those migrants straight from the island, especially from Puerto Rico, who are like, I don't really understand what you mean. I'm neither white nor black. And so we start to see evidence of this with teacher aides in particular. So later on, when we talk about the Comité, which was an organizing group, many of the organizers were mothers who were in the BU teaching education program. So they were doing their practicums around this time. So they were teacher aides, and they were witnessing this happen, which I think is fascinating as a parent, right? To imagine being in a classroom and seeing some white teacher designate race based on that. You also have reports of, and most of these are kind of anecdotal, unfortunately, of people designating race differently for people in the same family. So there's more than one case of people in the same family being designated as black and then another as white. The kind of infamous case, which I haven't been able to track down like the validity of this, but it's in every document I found, was one about twins, where one son was lighter skinned and one son was darker skinned. And so they were classified as different races. And that was kind of the epitome of what was going on in terms of, you know, even twins could be split up. So I think that's why I kind of wrote in that piece that it was arbitrary, because they really didn't acknowledge any kind of mixed race heritage. And the Latino groups wanted more of a kind of nationality based, or to consider kind of Hispanic as its own race. So later on in their reports, you know, they advocated to stop the existing racial census that kind of promotes racial division within the Latinx community, and instead to get the identification from the parents themselves. And so, yeah, the impacts were huge, though, because what they would essentially do is use Latinx students to desegregate all kinds of schools. So what you could do is take a darker-skinned Latinx student, call him black, and then have him integrate a white school. And that would actually make it so African Americans and white students didn't even have to move. So there was a lot of potential movement of just Latinx. So then you could also take light-skinned or, you know, white passing Latinx students and integrate black schools by saying now we're achieving more racial balance. So you see a lot of them kind of being used as those pawns. But the biggest implication was that if you start moving them, then there's no clusters and you can't have bilingual education, because bilingual education requires a certain number of students.
No, I think that's really helpful. And so you had already mentioned El Comité, but there was also another community organization, the Hispanic Office of Planning and Development at this time, or HOPE, that was kind of seeking to shape bilingual education during this period. So what were the difference between these two organizations, like in their structure, and then how did they envision bilingual education based on what you had just talked about, where you're having these clusters broken up, which makes it less viable?
Yeah. So HOPE was an existing organization that came around 1971. It was a nonprofit, community-based organization. They kind of had a broader agenda. It wasn't just focused on education. They looked at kind of health issues, training, workforce, leadership development. And it was, in many ways, kind of a typical nonprofit in terms of getting funding from the state. Whereas El Comité, which is the Parents Committee for the Defense of Bilingual Education, that was a really ad hoc group. So it emerged solely because of what was going on in desegregation. So it was very kind of loose and fluid. If most of the people I interviewed characterized it as El Comité was a grassroots organization run by working class mothers, and HOPE was a professional, which is coded language, right? Professional organization run mostly by men who were middle class, or at least kind of had a higher educational attainment. So that was the kind of biggest difference. I mean, I think El Comité, you know, came around thinking, what are we going to do? Clearly, the African American community didn't really think of us when they took this issue to court, right? But the desegregation will impact our children and our students, because many of them were teachers and parents. They were very different in terms of their training. Many of them were affiliated with the Puerto Rican Nationalist Party. I think they were a little bit more radical and left-leaning. And hope was very different. You know, there was questions about whether or not hope could represent the Latinx community at this time, because the Comité leaders felt that hope represented this kind of middle class, suburban, different kind of smaller aspect of the Latinx community. And many of them, their children weren't part of the bilingual ed program. Some of them didn't even live in Boston. They just kind of worked in Boston. So they were really concerned that even though Hope had kind of the infrastructure to handle kind of an intervention into the Morgan case, they felt like it wouldn't necessarily reflect the community. So yeah, there was a lot of conflict in terms of the differences, not only between nationalities. So they really wanted a Puerto Rican-led organization because the community in Boston was largely Puerto Rican. Frida Garcia was a Dominican woman who was part of Hope, one of the only women. So they didn't really want her representing them. They didn't, you know, there was this grassroots versus establishment. There was this class issue, right? Because many of the comité were kind of had, you know, low literacy levels and weren't necessarily involved except for that steering group. And then there were these gendered issues. So it's like a lot of layers here, where the comité women felt that they did all the labor, and then Hope organizers would kind of swoop in. I mean, it's classic when you study organizing history, they say women are organizers and men are the leaders, because you know, men show up where the cameras are and kind of take over the mic. So there was a lot of layers in terms of who could be the representative organization of the community and what could they do to save bilingual education.
Yeah, that was one of the things that struck me in your work, is just these layers of potential conflict. And so you talk a lot about adults and adults organizing, but another thread that your work follows is the role Latinx teens played in shaping bilingual education. And so I'd like to just hear your thoughts on that. So like, what inspired these student activists? Particularly, you spend a lot of time talking about Pedro Bellos, and how did their vision for bilingual education differ from the district's vision?
I find some evidence in the Boston Globe and in the Bay State Banner of student organizing with the, you know, Pedro Bellos leading students in boycott to get out of South Boston High. I included that mostly because I think it's fascinating and it really challenges this idea of Latinx people and just people in color generally wanting to be in white schools. So sometimes the way desegregation struggles are framed is that people of color are so desperate to sit alongside white students, and that's what they want. And here what you have is a predominantly white school with a very small bilingual ed program, and Latinx students saying, we are being mistreated, this is the most hostile, racist, violent place, which really South Boston epitomizes. Anybody who knows anything about Boston knows that that's not a safe space. It was never a safe space. It was one of those places where Black and brown people wouldn't want to go into that space at night. And they didn't want to send their kids to school there. So I like that it really complicates this idea that like integration is the solution. Because here they're saying like, we're not learning anything, we don't feel like it's safe, and instead, our goal is to be transferred to Roxbury High, which is also interesting because these are kind of situated as like polar opposites, right? Roxbury High being all Black, South Boston High being all white, and here are Latino Puerto Ricans kind of in the middle being like, well, don't send me to the white school, I'll take the Black school any day because I feel like it's safer. In terms of what that represents for younger kind of teen activists, I think what's interesting is that many of them were kind of Puerto Rican nationalists. I think that's important kind of context, coming from the island, having migrated kind of more recently. I think that's interesting because it shaped their politics. And the younger students I find in kind of the initial beginning of this research were much more diasporic in terms of how they understood identity. They were kind of more into third world politics and the kind of overlaps between Puerto Rican and Black nationalism. So you start to see some of the teens being more drawn to organizations like the Black Panther Party chapter in Boston, the Boston Black United Front. There's a group called Poro Afro, which is like a Puerto Rican group to kind of that it was all Black Puerto Ricans. So you start to see them being more interested in those groups, which are very different than La Alianza Hispana, Hope, all these kinds of more traditional kind of social service organizations that are run by, you know, adults in their 30s and 40s and 50s, right? So the teens are not really drawn to those groups. If anything, they're like the children of those activists, right? So now they're the next generation. So their politics are very different. They align much more with kind of Black power ideologies. So I'm hoping to start to unpack some of that, because I'm interested in how they conceptualize race very differently than the generation right above them.
So one question that I want to ask is related to, or the final question that I want to ask is related to kind of, I think, students' identity. So we started out talking about how students were identified racially by teachers or other administrators. And then you had just talked about how youth are kind of the way that they're understanding themselves, and especially with so many of them recently coming from Puerto Rico, thinking about themselves in those different terms. And so as we think about these different identities, different needs of students, and how schools can service those needs, what resonates from this history with you as you're thinking about education today? Maybe El Comite's demands for bilingual education might expand how educators think about justice in education. I'm curious what you have to say.
Yeah, I mean, obviously the issue of bilingual ed is not going away, right? We have this kind of debate. You know, in 2002, when bilingual ed was banned in Massachusetts, you know, we have 15 years of no bilingual ed, and then 2017, it opened up again with that kind of overturned law. It restores it as an option. I think that the story is much bigger than Massachusetts, where, you know, ELL students are kind of low numbers in comparison to the kind of broader nation. But I think what's interesting here is a lot of things. One is, I think that parents have political power, right? And parents often have better solutions than educational lawmakers, right? And I think that that's because they know their communities. They've been around, they've been fighting the fight, right? The good fight. Massachusetts was a leader in bilingual education for decades. So when people say things like they're not, you know, Latinx parents are not involved in their communities, and they don't come to schools, and they don't go to parent-teacher conferences, right? That upsets me, because my work and lots of folks' work really challenges all these pathologies of Black and brown parents as being politically inactive. And you can see that a lot now, especially with COVID, right? You see how many Black and brown folks are showing up. So I mentioned before that my partner works in Lawrence Public Schools, which is, if you don't know anything about the area, Lawrence is over 90, I would beg to say over 95% Latino. It's a huge Latinx city in Massachusetts. And the involvement of the parents there during this kind of COVID crisis has been amazing. I mean, just always, but especially when things are, you know, are up. So I think some of the biggest things that we learned from this story is that desegregation is not the end all be all, right? In this case, busing, right, wasn't the solution. Parents have political power. They have much more kind of comprehensive plans in mind, and that they want to tailor them specifically to the needs of their community. And the community is diverse, right? So not everyone's going to agree. So in my research in the larger project, I look at how African American and Latinx educational struggles are different, and where are they parallel and not intersecting intentionally, because they had different issues, right? African Americans wanted integration in many ways, and Latinx students just wanted bilingual ed, which often meant the opposite of integration. It meant clustering. So I think, you know, the thing you learn is that educational racial justice looks different depending on who you ask.
And so that was really well put, and I appreciate you sharing that. And so Amber, you're currently teaching in New York City schools, which has its own kind of troubled history with desegregation and providing bilingual ed. And so I'm just wondering, based on this conversation, what are you thinking about differently? We're thinking about how we might reimagine schools in a way that is cognizant of all these differences and all these different student needs. How are you thinking we might reimagine what that looks like?
Yeah. So yeah, Dr. Cruz, you said a lot of things that
resonated with me. I always say a lot of things. Yeah.
No, I mean, same. Same. But in my own school, these are recent conversations we've been having, part of larger ongoing conversations, because my school is in a district that has been profiled, you know, in the news as a district that is in the midst of this kind of integration push. And so some of the things that have come up in our conversations, and just like something I'm thinking about as a result of this, is just the role of parents, and how assumptions, I think, at the district level are often made about what parents want based on their ethnicity, based on their geographical location, and based on their socioeconomic status. And so something I've just been thinking about in regards to COVID in particular is what does parent activism look like in a way that is more inclusive? Because that narrative, unfortunately, that you just expressed, that like Black and brown parents don't show up, is sometimes overtly said, but more often than not, it's covert, right? It's this idea that, you know, and I'll put teachers in that category too. Like, teachers often know what's best for kids, but you know, if you don't have the family stakeholders at the table, you run into problems like what I think you showed so beautifully in your work, which is that there was no understanding of family need, just in terms of deciding from on high, like where kids would go to school. And that's such an important decision. So I think for me, reimagining what this can look like in a way that's more inclusive and perpetuates equity is having more family involvement, because it's an academic conversation. I feel like, you know, it's this idea, this recognition, well, based on the data, we feel families would want this, or, you know, based on this series of studies that were commissioned, we feel families want this. But so often it's like, just go ask the families what they want.
Yeah.
And one thing that I think I take away from both of your comments and thinking about this conversation, especially during kind of this moment with coronavirus, is that when we often talk about school reform, we're talking about what's in front of students and what's happening within the classrooms, and it's walled off from the community. And really what I'm hearing from you both is the push for reimagining education is to actually not reimagine it and just ask others how they would imagine education for their children. So these other options that people have to choose wouldn't necessarily exist, because what communities are hoping for, they would be able to find, you know, down the block as opposed to an hour away.
Yeah, that's the dream, right? That was very well said.
I agree.
And came off. Well, thank you so much for both of you for your time today and your insights. Dr. Cruz, thank you so much for sharing that history. And Amber, thank you so much for your thoughtful questions and insights. For those of you watching, remember to share this on social media, and please post questions to us that you have after this episode so that we can follow up with future ideas for future episodes. Thank you.